My parents did not show up to my grandfather's U.S. funeral. 3 hours later, they posted photos drinking margaritas on a Caribbean island with the caption, "Enjoying life while we can." That is when I got a text from my dead grandfather's U.S. phone. "Sweetheart, come to my house now." When I rushed to his estate, what I saw made my blood run cold. My name is Cassidy. I am 32 years old and I work as a corporate fraud investigator. For years, my family mocked my career. They called it boring paperwork and told me I was wasting my life staring at spreadsheets. They had no idea those exact skills were about to dismantle their entire existence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to be your family. The rain in Seattle was relentless that morning, coming down in cold sheets that soaked through my black wool coat. I stood completely alone under a dark umbrella at the cemetery. The priest was reading the final eulogy for my grandfather Harrison. He was 82 years old, a brilliant businessman who had built his wealth from the ground up and remained sharp until his final days. He was the only person in my family who ever understood me. He praised my logical mind and my demanding career. Now he was gone, and as I looked at the row of empty folding chairs set up under the canopy, a bitter lump formed in my throat. There were supposed to be family members sitting in those chairs. My mother Brenda and my father Richard should have been in the front row. My younger sister Sienna should have been sitting next to them with her husband Jamal. When my grandfather passed away 3 days ago, my mother called me in fake tears. She claimed she was too devastated to attend the funeral. She said her grief was causing physical panic attacks, and she needed to step away from everything to process the loss. My father backed her up, saying they could not bear to see his casket lowered into the ground. Sienna claimed she was staying by their side to support them through the trauma. I had believed them. I stood in the freezing rain, shivering and listening to the priest talk about family bonds, genuinely thinking my parents and sister were sitting in their house mourning. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I usually ignore my phone during important moments, but a strange instinct told me to look. It was an Instagram notification. Sienna had tagged me in a new post. Sienna is a 29-year-old lifestyle influencer. Her entire existence revolves around aesthetics, free sponsorships, and playing the victim whenever someone challenges her fake reality. I swiped open the notification and my heart physically dropped. The photo was brilliantly lit, showcasing the crystal blue waters of the Bahamas. Sienna was posing on the edge of a luxury yacht in a designer bikini. Next to her was Jamal, her 31-year-old African-American husband. Jamal is a crypto investor, the kind of guy who constantly brags about decentralized finance on social media, acts like a financial guru, but secretly leeches off my family U.S. money to fund his flashy lifestyle. In the photo, Jamal was holding a massive tropical cocktail and showing off a heavy gold watch. But the real gut punch was in the background. My mother and father were lounging on beach chairs holding matching margaritas, their faces split into wide, carefree smiles. I stared at the screen as the cold rain hit my face. The caption beneath the photo read, "Life is short. Enjoying life while we can. Sorry we could not make it to the gloomy funeral." Gloomy funeral. I read the words again, feeling a hot wave of pure rage rise in my chest. They lied. There was no grief. There were no panic attacks. They had used the weekend of my grandfather's U.S. funeral to fly to the Caribbean for a luxury vacation. They chose margaritas on a yacht over burying the man who had funded their upper-middle-class facade for decades. Brenda and Richard were drowning in consumer debt, obsessed with country club status they could barely afford, and yet they abandoned his funeral for a photo opportunity. The utter disrespect made me sick to my stomach. I was standing 10 feet away from his casket, and my own blood relatives were openly mocking the occasion to their millions of followers. My hands shook as I gripped the phone. I was ready to call my mother right then and there. I wanted to scream into the receiver. I wanted to demand how she could be so soulless, so devoid of basic human decency. My thumb hovered over her contact name, my vision blurring with angry tears. Just as I was about to hit dial, a new text message popped up at the top of my screen. It was an SMS message. I stared at the sender US name and the breath left my lungs entirely. Grandpa Harrison. I froze. The phone almost slipped from my wet fingers. I stared at the name, blinking rapidly. Grandpa Harrison was dead. His body was literally in the wooden casket a few feet in front of me. The message preview was short and direct. "Sweetheart, come to my house now." My mind started racing. I am a corporate fraud investigator. My entire career is built on analyzing anomalies, spotting inconsistencies, and finding the truth behind deception. This was a massive anomaly. Who had his phone? He had been in a medical care facility for his final weeks before falling into a coma. Did a nurse steal it? Did the hospital staff take it? Was this a sick, twisted prank by Sienna? I quickly dismissed that idea. Sienna was busy posting yacht photos in the Bahamas. She did not have the brains or the geographical proximity to pull off a prank in Seattle. I did not wait for the priest to finish his final prayer. I turned away from the grave, my heels sinking into the wet mud, and ran toward my car. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I threw myself into the driver US seat, tossed the wet umbrella aside, and started the engine. The drive from the cemetery to my grandfather's historic estate usually took 40 minutes in Seattle traffic. I made it in 25. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, running red lights and cutting through narrow residential streets. My grandfather lived in a massive classic stone house in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. As I turned onto his street, I expected to see the house silent and locked up exactly as it should be during a period of mourning. Instead, I was met with a scene of absolute chaos. Two enormous moving trucks were parked on the circular driveway. The heavy wooden front doors were propped wide open. 4 strangers in work uniforms were marching in and out of the house. I slammed on the brakes, parked haphazardly on the grass, and leaped out of my car. Through the rain, I watched in horror as these men hauled out my grandfather's life. They were carrying his antique leather armchairs, his vintage grandfather clock, and carefully wrapped oil paintings. As I ran up the driveway, 2 men emerged from the front doors, grunting under the weight of a massive steel safe. It was the safe from his private study. The violation hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather had not even been in the ground for an hour, and his home was being stripped bare. "Stop what you are doing!" I yelled, running up the front steps. "Put that down right now!" A burly man with a clipboard stepped in front of me, blocking my path to the front door. He wore a jacket with a moving company logo. "Hey, lady, calm down. We are just doing our job. We were hired to clear out the estate." "Hired by who?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. "The owner of this house just died. His funeral is literally happening right now. You are trespassing on a deceased person's property." The manager rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed by my anger. He pulled a thick document from his clipboard and shoved it toward my chest. "Look, we are operating legally. We were hired by the legal representatives of the estate. Read it yourself." I snatched the document from his hand. As a fraud investigator, I read legal contracts and financial authorizations every single day. I scanned the pages rapidly, looking for the authorization signatures. It was a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney document. It granted total unrestricted control over Harrison U.S. physical assets, bank accounts, and real estate properties. I flipped to the signature page. My stomach dropped. The document was signed by Brenda and Richard, my parents. But the dates made absolutely no sense. The signature date was from 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, my grandfather had already suffered a massive stroke and was lying in a hospital bed in a medically induced coma. He was completely unresponsive. He could not speak, let alone sign a document granting my parents full legal authority to liquidate his home. "This is a forgery," I said, looking up at the moving manager. "The man whose name is on this document was in a coma on the date this was supposedly signed. You need to stop moving these items immediately." The manager crossed his arms. "Listen, lady, the notary stamp is real. The signatures are on paper. I do not care about family drama. We have a contract and we are taking this stuff to an auction house. I was about to pull out my phone to dial 911 when a calm, authoritative voice echoed from the dark hallway of the house. "Let them proceed, Cassidy." I froze. Stepping out of the shadows of the stripped-down foyer was Oliver. He was 60 years old, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit. Oliver had been my grandfather, U.S. personal estate attorney and closest confidant for over 30 years. In his right hand, he was holding my grandfather, U.S. smartphone. "You sent the text," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Oliver nodded slowly. His face was grim, etched with lines of exhaustion and suppressed anger. "Yes, Cassidy. I needed you to see this with your own eyes. Come into the study. We have much to discuss." I followed him into the house. The place echoed with emptiness. The Persian rugs were gone. The mahogany tables were gone. We walked into the study, which had been completely gutted. Oliver closed the heavy oak doors, shutting out the noise of the moving crew outside. Oliver looked at me, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Your parents did not just hire movers, Cassidy. While your grandfather was lying in that hospital bed completely unresponsive, Brenda and Richard came to visit. They did not come to hold his hand. They did not come to say goodbye. They came with a corrupt notary public they had bribed. They forged his signature on that power of attorney document." I felt sick. I knew my parents were materialistic and shallow, but forging legal documents over a dying man's U.S. bed was a new level of depravity. "They are selling his furniture," I said, staring at the empty spaces against the walls. Oliver shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "The furniture is just pocket change to them. It is a distraction. They use that forged power of attorney to bypass the bank's standard legal protocols before your grandfather officially passed away." "What do you mean?" I asked, my investigative instincts instantly kicking into high gear. "What exactly did they do?" "Oliver?" Oliver looked me dead in the eye. "They liquidated his entire retirement fund, $3 million in cash. They wiped out his accounts the moment the forged document was accepted by the bank manager. Your parents did not fly to the Bahamas to grieve Cassidy. They flew to the Bahamas to celebrate a $3 million heist." The room spun around me. $3 million. My parents, the people who constantly complained about credit card debt, had orchestrated a massive financial crime while their own father was taking his final breaths. They had abandoned his funeral to drink margaritas on a yacht funded by his stolen life savings. And as I stood there in the empty study, listening to the rain beat against the windows, the corporate fraud investigator inside me fully awakened. They thought they had pulled off the perfect crime. They thought they could walk away with millions and leave me standing alone in a graveyard. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. I did not cry. The tears that had been gathering in my eyes just moments ago completely evaporated. The overwhelming grief of losing my grandfather was instantly replaced by the ice-cold hyper-focus that made me one of the top corporate fraud investigators in my firm. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and turned to Oliver. "Give me the account numbers," I demanded, my voice dropping to a deadpan professional tone. "Every piece of paper you have regarding his retirement funds, the bank branch they used, the transaction IDs. I need it all right now." Oliver reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. It was a preliminary bank statement he had managed to secure from his contacts at the financial institution before my parents fully locked him out. I snatched the paper from his hand and ran straight out the front doors, ignoring the moving crew hauling away a vintage credenza. I yanked open my car door, grabbed my encrypted work laptop from the passenger seat, and sprinted back into the empty study. There was no furniture left, so I dropped to my knees and set the laptop on the bare hardwood floor. I booted it up, connected to my secure mobile hotspot, and opened my specialized investigative software. My fingers flew across the keyboard. In my line of work, I track multi-million-dollar embezzlements for massive corporations. I know how dirty money moves. People think they can hide cash in the digital age, but large wire transfers always leave digital footprints. Even with a forged power of attorney, money does not just vanish into thin air. It creates a trail. I looked at the printed statement Oliver had given me. The transfer had been executed exactly 48 hours ago. A single massive withdrawal of $3 million from Harrison U.S. primary retirement portfolio. The funds had been wired out immediately. I typed the routing and account numbers into my tracking database. Usually, amateur thieves transfer stolen funds into their own personal bank accounts, making them incredibly easy to catch. I fully expected to see the money sitting in some local Bank of America account under Brenda or Richard U.S. name. I expected to see them paying off their massive credit card debts or throwing it into Jamal U.S. sketchy crypto wallets. But as the search results populated on my screen, my brow furrowed. The money was not at Bank of America. It had not gone to Chase or Wells Fargo. The funds had bounced through a clearinghouse in New York, scrubbed their domestic identifiers, and then vanished offshore. Grand Cayman, I muttered, staring at the swift codes flashing on my screen. They wired the money to the Cayman Islands. Oliver stood over my shoulder looking down at the screen. "That does not make any sense," he said, his voice laced with confusion. "Your parents are reckless spenders, but they are not criminal masterminds. They barely know how to file their own taxes. They would not know the first thing about setting up an offshore account." "Jamal knows," I replied, my jaw tightening as the pieces started clicking together. Jamal brags about decentralized finance and avoiding government oversight on his podcasts all the time. He knows exactly how to move money across borders to evade the IRS. He orchestrated this. I dug deeper. As a licensed fraud investigator, I have access to international corporate registry databases that the general public cannot reach. I bypassed the superficial banking layers and accessed the Cayman Islands corporate registry. I needed to find the exact entity that received the $3 million wire. It took me 7 minutes of relentless typing and cross-referencing to break through the privacy shields. Finally, the receiving entity popped up on my screen. It was a shell company, a limited liability company registered under the name Apex Global Ventures, LLC. It had been incorporated just 3 weeks ago, perfectly timing with when my grandfather suffered his stroke. I pulled up the incorporation documents to find the beneficial owner. I needed to see who actually controlled this shell company. I scanned the digital paperwork, looking for Brenda Richard Sienna or Jamal. I was ready to screenshot the evidence handed over to the authorities and watch my family get arrested for wire fraud. But as my eyes landed on the registered owner section, my heart stopped beating. The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold and paralyzed. I stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The registered owner of Apex Global Ventures, LLC, was not Brenda. It was not Richard. It was not Jamal. The name on the offshore company was Cassidy, my name. My home address in Seattle was listed as the primary corporate headquarters. My personal phone number was on the registration forms. But the most horrifying detail, the detail that made the room spin out of control, was sitting right at the bottom of the page. They had used my exact social security number to establish the offshore tax haven. I slammed the laptop shut as if it were on fire. I pushed myself back against the wall, my chest heaving as panic clawed at my throat. "What is it?" Oliver asked, dropping to a crouch beside me, alarmed by my sudden physical reaction. "What did you find?" "They stole my identity," I gasped, clutching my chest. "My parents did not just steal $3 million, Oliver. They stole my social security number. They opened the shell company in my name. The money is sitting in a Cayman Islands account that is legally tied to me." Oliver Yu's face turned an ashen gray. The legal implications hit him just as hard as they hit me. My parents had orchestrated the ultimate betrayal. They had not just robbed a dying man. They had actively framed their own daughter for a massive federal crime. In the United States, moving $3 million of stolen funds across international borders is wire fraud. Opening an offshore account without declaring it is severe tax evasion. Money laundering on this scale triggers an immediate response from the IRS and the FBI. If any federal agency flagged this transaction, they would not go looking for Brenda and Richard drinking margaritas on a yacht. The algorithm would point directly to my social security number. The federal government would freeze my assets. The professional board would strip me of my fraud investigator license. I would be indicted, dragged through federal court, and handed a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. My own parents had sacrificed my entire life, my career, my freedom, and my future, all so they could buy luxury real estate with Jamal and Sienna. They had served me up on a silver platter to the IRS, confident that I would take the fall while they enjoyed the stolen millions in the sun. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan was suffocating. I sat on the hardwood floor, the reality of my impending federal indictment crushing down on me, knowing I had to confront the monsters who gave me life. I grabbed my phone from the hardwood floor. My hands were no longer shaking. The paralyzing panic that had gripped me just moments ago burned away, leaving nothing behind but cold, concentrated rage. I pulled up Brenda U.S. contact information. I could not even bring myself to think of her as my mother anymore. She was a hostile target in a massive financial fraud investigation. I hit the FaceTime button and held the phone up, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. The screen buffered for a moment. In the background, I could hear the steady rhythm of the Seattle rain lashing against the large glass windows of my grandfather's strip study. Then the video feed connected, and the sheer contrast between my reality and hers was physically nauseating. Brenda was lounging on the pristine white teak deck of a luxury catamaran. The brilliant turquoise waters of the Bahamas glittered brightly behind her, completely disconnected from the dark, grim reality I was standing in. She was wearing a designer silk cover-up that probably cost more than my first car. Her eyes were hidden behind massive Gucci sunglasses, and she held a crystal glass of chilled white wine in her perfectly manicured hand. She looked utterly relaxed, soaking in the Caribbean sun, without a single care in the world. Cassidy, really? Brenda sighed, taking a delicate sip of her wine before lazily adjusting her wide-brimmed sun hat. I thought we made it abundantly clear we needed space to grieve. Your grandfather's passing has been incredibly traumatic for me. You calling right now is ruining the vibe completely. You used my social security number, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I did not yell. Yelling implies a loss of control, and I was entirely focused. You forged a power of attorney, stole $3 million from a dying man, and wired it to a Cayman Islands shell company registered in my exact name. I expected denial. I expected her to play dumb, to act shocked, or to immediately blame some shady financial advisor. That is how typical fraudsters react when confronted. Instead, Brenda let out a short, irritated huff. She waved her free hand in the air dismissively, as if I had just reminded her to take out the trash. Oh, please stop being so incredibly dramatic, Cassidy. You are giving me a migraine. Your grandfather was 82 years old and literally in a coma. The doctors said he was not waking up. He was going to die anyway. What exactly was he going to do with $3 million pay for a fancier wooden box to rot in? You stole his life savings while he was hooked up to machines, I shot back, gripping the phone tighter. And you framed me for federal wire fraud. We did not frame anyone, Brenda scoffed, adjusting her position on the expensive sun lounger. We just borrowed your excellent credit profile. Sienna and Jamal are at a critical point in their careers right now. They are major influencers, Cassidy. They need premium content to stay relevant. Jamal found this absolutely incredible mansion in Calabasas. It is perfect for their brand image. But they needed raw cash to bypass the mortgage approval process. You know how banks are these days with crypto investors. They do not understand Jamal's vision. You set me up to take the fall with the IRS, so your golden child could buy a mansion in Calabasas. Are you out of your mind? You are just an office worker, Cassidy, Brenda said, her tone dripping with absolute condescension. You sit in a dreary cubicle and push boring papers around all day. You do not have a public image to protect. Sienna has brand deals. She has an audience of millions. If Jamal put that offshore money in his name, the taxes alone would ruin their purchasing power. Your name on the paperwork just made logistical sense. It was the smart family move. Logistical sense. She actually called federal tax evasion and identity theft a smart family move. I stared at the screen, utterly repulsed by the sociopathy staring back at me. She fully believed that sacrificing my freedom to fund Sienna's luxury lifestyle was just standard protocol. Brenda, this is international money laundering. I explained slowly, emphasizing every word so she could comprehend the gravity of her actions. When the IRS audits that Cayman account, I will not just get a fine, I will lose my investigator license. I will go to federal prison. Do you understand that you are sending your own daughter to a federal penitentiary? Brenda took another leisurely sip of her wine, completely unfazed by the threat of my imprisonment. Then you will just have to deal with the IRS, using those little accounting skills you brag about so much. Think of it as a professional challenge for your boring job. I looked over Brenda's shoulder on the screen. I could see Sienna walking across the deck of the catamaran in a neon bikini. She was holding a selfie stick, recording herself laughing and tossing her hair for her followers. Jamal was standing right next to her, staring intently at his smartphone, likely checking his offshore crypto wallets. They were entirely unbothered. They had ruined my life, hijacked my identity, and were currently making social media content funded by a dead man with stolen wealth. We fed you, clothed you, and paid for your braces when you were an awkward teenager. Brenda continued, her voice hardening with arrogant entitlement. You owe us. Consider this taking the heat for the family as your way of paying us back. It is called filial piety, Cassidy. Look it up. The sheer audacity of her words paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. She actually smiled, a smug, self-satisfied smirk. She viewed my impending federal indictment as a minor inconvenience I should gladly accept to repay her for doing the bare minimum of parenting. She honestly felt entitled to trade my future for a Calabasas mansion. I am not going to take the heat, I stated, my tone dropping to an icy chill. I am going to report this to the authorities right now. I am handing over every IP address, every forged signature, and every wire transfer receipt to the federal government. Brenda lowered her Gucci sunglasses, glaring fiercely into the camera. You will not do any such thing. If you go to the police, you will destroy this family. You will ruin your sister-us career right when she is peaking. Is that what you want? To be the bitter, jealous older sister who tore her own family apart because she could not stand seeing them succeed? You tore this family apart the moment you bribed a notary while your father was choking on a ventilator, I fired back. You are so incredibly selfish, Cassidy. Always thinking about yourself? Brenda sneered, shaking her head in disgust. Just fix the tax issue on your end and let us enjoy our grief trip in peace. I have to go. The yacht chef is serving caviar and I do not want it to get warm. Before Brenda could hit the end call button, a thick hand covered in heavy gold rings reached into the frame and snatched the phone away from her. The screen shook dizzily for a second before stabilizing on the smug, grinning face of Jamal. My brother-in-law adjusted his designer sunglasses, the tropical sun reflecting off the thick diamond chain resting against his bare chest. He leaned over the railing of the yacht, giving me a full view of the expensive vessel they had chartered using my grandfather's blood money. Look who is throwing a tantrum! Jamal laughed, his voice booming with the arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room. Brenda is right, Cassidy. You are always killing the vibe. We are out here securing generational wealth, and you are having a meltdown over some paperwork. I glared at him through the screen, stealing $3 million from a dying man and laundering it through a shell company. In my name is not securing generational wealth, Jamal. It is a federal crime. Jamal let out a loud, obnoxious chuckle. He shook his head slowly, looking at me as if I were a clueless child who simply did not understand how the real world operated. He took a sip from his own drink, savoring the moment, enjoying the absolute power he thought he held over my life. Oh, please, he scoffed, flashing a row of perfectly bleached veneers. You think you are so intimidating because you work in a cubicle chasing missing receipts for boring corporations. But you are out of your depth here, sis. This is the big leagues. You want to go cry to the police? Go ahead. Call the cops right now. Call the IRS. Call the FBI. Do it. He leaned closer to the camera, his smile dropping into a cold, menacing sneer. Let us see who they lock up first. Do you really think federal agents are going to believe a sad, jealous sister trying to frame her successful family out of pure spite? Because I promise you the digital paper trail points directly, unequivocally to you. The IP addresses were spoofed by a professional. The digital signatures match your exact credentials. The Cayman accounts were opened using your social security number, your primary residence, and your employment history. We built an airtight profile. As far as the United States government is concerned, Apex Global Ventures is entirely your brainchild. If the feds come knocking, they are knocking on your door, not my Calabasas mansion. My hands gripped the edge of my laptop. He was banking on the slow, bureaucratic nightmare of the federal justice system. He knew that by the time I could prove my innocence, my life would already be ruined. I would be arrested, my assets frozen, my professional reputation completely destroyed. He was exploiting my responsible nature, betting that I would be too terrified of the legal fallout to pull the alarm. "You are a parasite, Jamal," I said, my voice vibrating with a rage I could barely contain. "You are nothing but a flashy leech draining my family dry because you have never built anything real in your entire life." That struck a nerve. Jamal's jaw clenched, the arrogant smirk faltering for a brief second before his massive ego overrode his anger. "You just do not get the vision," he shot back, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "You are stuck in the matrix working a 9 to 5 until you die. I am playing chess while you are playing checkers. That 3 million is just seed capital. Do you have any idea what the crypto markets are doing right now? I have insider access to a decentralized finance protocol that is about to explode. I am going to turn that 3 million into 10 million by the end of the quarter." He actually believed it. He was a textbook crypto bro, high on his own supply of internet buzzwords and fake alpha energy. He genuinely thought he could gamble away stolen retirement funds on volatile digital tokens and emerge a billionaire. He was entirely disconnected from the catastrophic legal reality of moving stolen funds across international borders. "When I flip this cash and buy that estate in the hills, Sienna and I are going to be unstoppable," he boasted, gesturing wildly with his free hand to encompass the yacht and the ocean behind him. "We are launching a lifestyle brand. We are getting a reality show pitched together. This money was meant to be leverage for our empire. Your grandfather was a dinosaur who hoarded cash in traditional markets like an absolute idiot. I am putting it to work. You should be thanking me for stepping up and taking control of the family U.S. future." "Thanking you for identity theft?" I asked, utterly repulsed by his psychotic logic. "No thanking me for letting you be a small part of our success story." He sneered, his confidence fully restored. "So here is what is going to happen, Cassidy. You are going to be a smart little investigator. You are going to keep your mouth shut, go back to your boring office, and figure out how to bury the tax liability on your end. Use those accounting tricks you are so proud of to make the IRS look the other way. If you play along and keep the government off our backs, maybe I will toss you 100 grand when my tokens go to the moon. I am going to destroy you, Jamal," I promised, staring directly into his eyes, through the screen channeling every ounce of my professional resolve. "I am going to tear your fake empire down to the studs and watch you lose everything." Jamal just laughed again, a loud grating sound that echoed over the Caribbean wind. "Good luck explaining that to the feds from a prison cell, sis. Enjoy the rain in Seattle." The screen went black. He ended the call. I stood alone in the gutted study of my grandfather's house. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the relentless pounding of the rain against the window panes. My phone screen reflected my own pale, shocked face. They had really done it. They had stolen millions, framed me for international wire fraud, and sailed off into the sunset, leaving me holding a ticking legal time bomb. The sheer weight of their betrayal pressed down on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. Before I could even process the magnitude of Jamal's threat, my phone violently vibrated in my palm. Then it vibrated again, and again. A rapid, unceasing barrage of notifications flooded my lock screen. At first, I thought it was Jamal sending taunting text messages or Brenda demanding I fix the tax issue. But the icons multiplying on my screen were not text messages. They were social media alerts, Instagram tags, TikTok mentions, direct messages from accounts I did not follow. I swiped open the first notification, which linked directly to Sienna's TikTok account. My sister had over 2 million followers, an audience she had cultivated by projecting the ultimate soft girl aesthetic built entirely on false positivity and curated morning routines. I clicked the video that was currently pinned to the top of her profile. It had been uploaded mere minutes after Jamal hung up on me, and it already had hundreds of thousands of views. The video started with Sienna sitting on the edge of a pristine white bed inside the yacht's master cabin. The lighting was meticulously arranged to catch the faint glisten of fake tears on her cheeks. She was wearing an oversized, cozy knit sweater, looking small, fragile, and utterly heartbroken. It was a masterclass in digital manipulation. "Hey guys," Sienna began, her voice quivering with perfectly calibrated vulnerability. "I usually only share the happy parts of my life with you, but my family is going through something incredibly dark right now, and I need to speak my truth before the rumors start." She paused, taking a shaky breath and wiping away a non-existent tear from her perfectly contoured cheekbone. "As many of you know, my beloved grandfather just passed away. We are completely devastated. But what is making this tragedy so much worse is my older sister Cassidy." Sienna looked down at her hands, playing the part of the traumatized sibling flawlessly. "Cassidy has always struggled with her mental health. She has been deeply resentful of my success for years, but the jealousy has turned into something terrifying. The moment our grandfather passed, she suffered a complete psychological breakdown. She stormed into his house, demanded total control of his estate, and started threatening our parents. I gripped the phone so hard my fingers cramped. She was spinning the narrative in real time, turning her own family's heinous crime into a story of my supposed insanity. It got so hostile, so emotionally abusive that Jamal and I had to step in." Sienna continued, her voice dropping to a fragile whisper. "She threatened to destroy my career. She threatened to drain my parents' bank accounts. We honestly feared for our physical safety. My parents were so traumatized by her aggression that Jamal and I had to physically remove them from the environment. We brought them on this healing retreat just to protect them from her toxicity. We had to flee our own grandfather's funeral just to stay safe. Please pray for my sister to get the psychiatric help she desperately needs, but right now we have to protect our peace." The video looped back to the beginning. I stood there absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, calculated malice of her performance. Sienna had not just preemptively covered up their absence from the funeral, she had entirely discredited me to millions of people. If I went to the police now, I would look exactly like the unhinged, greedy, mentally unstable sister she had just described to the world. Jamal and Sienna had weaponized her massive platform to build an impenetrable wall of public sympathy. I opened the comment section. It was a bloodbath. Thousands of comments poured in every second, a tidal wave of cyberbullying directed squarely at me. Her followers were vicious, attacking my character, my career, and my sanity. They called me a corporate drone who cared more about money than a grieving family. They tagged my employer on Twitter, demanding I be fired for elder abuse and workplace instability. They flooded my personal accounts with death threats and hateful messages telling me I belonged in a psychiatric ward. Then the personal texts started rolling in. The social media mob was bad, but the betrayal from my own extended family was a knife to the gut. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not spoken to me in years were suddenly blowing up my phone, having watched Sienna's video and swallowed her lies without a single question. My Aunt Margaret, Brenda's sister, sent a long, scathing paragraph. "How dare you attack your mother while she is grieving her own father? You have always been a bitter, ungrateful child, Cassidy. Sienna and Jamal are saints for taking your parents away from your toxic outbursts. Do not ever contact me again." My cousin David chimed in next. "We all knew you were jealous of Sienna, but trying to steal Grandpa's money while the body is still warm. You are a pathetic failure. Get psychiatric help before you end up in a straitjacket." Message after message, the vitriol piled up. Ungrateful wretch, jealous failure, money-hungry psychopath. Not a single one of them asked for my side of the story. Not one of them paused to wonder why my parents were suddenly vacationing on a luxury yacht during a funeral, or why I was the only blood relative actually standing at the gravesite in the pouring rain. They loved Sienna's shiny, curated internet persona, and they eagerly accepted the narrative that the quiet, serious corporate investigator was the villain of the family. The feeling of isolation was absolute. I was standing in a house stripped to the bare walls by thieves holding a phone that was vibrating with the hatred of my entire bloodline. Jamal had boxed me in legally, and now Sienna had boxed me in socially. They had orchestrated a flawless character assassination. They wanted me to feel so small, so hated, and so universally despised that I would crawl into a hole and quietly accept the federal prison sentence they had prepared for me. This was psychological warfare designed to break me, to make me doubt my own sanity and surrender to their overwhelming leverage. I watched the hateful messages multiply on my screen, every single ping a reminder of how utterly alone I was in this fight, facing a family that would gladly watch me burn to keep themselves warm. I stared at the screen, my eyes burning from the relentless influx of digital hatred. Just as I moved my thumb to power off the phone and silence the mob, a completely different notification slid across the top of my screen. It was not an Instagram tag. It was not an angry text from an aunt. It was an urgent alert from my premium identity monitoring service, followed immediately by an automated high-priority email from my primary bank, U.S. Fraud Department. I opened the email, my professional instincts taking over. The subject line read, "Urgent compliance inquiry regarding offshore transfer." My chest tightened. I clicked the secure link, logging in with trembling fingers. The message was from the bank U.S. Anti-Money Laundering Division. They were formally notifying me that a $3 million international wire transfer executed under my Social Security number had triggered a mandatory suspicious activity report. Because the destination was a known tax haven in the Cayman Islands, the transaction had been automatically flagged under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. The email explicitly stated that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Internal Revenue Service had been notified. My phone slipped from my grasp and clattered against the hardwood floor. I could barely breathe. The walls of the empty study seemed to shrink, pressing in on me from all sides. The federal government was already involved. Jamal had executed the wire transfer with such reckless, amateurish speed that it had instantly tripped the federal banking algorithms. And because the shell company was registered in my name with my credentials, the government algorithms had painted a massive red bullseye directly on my back. As a certified fraud examiner, I knew exactly what happened next. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division does not ask nicely. They do not care about family drama. They care about paper trails. And the paper trail Jamal had manufactured was airtight. Soon, federal agents would freeze all my domestic bank accounts. They would place a lien on my modest townhouse. I would not be able to buy groceries, let alone hire a high-powered defense attorney. I mentally calculated the legal nightmare crashing down on me. Defending myself against international money laundering and wire fraud charges would require specialized federal defense counsel. The retainer alone would cost upwards of $200,000. I would be bankrupt before the trial even began. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. The moment a federal indictment was unsealed, my employer would fire me immediately. A corporate fraud investigator cannot hold a security clearance or a professional license while under investigation for the exact crimes they are paid to prevent. My career, which I had sacrificed years to build, would evaporate overnight. I would be stripped of my credentials, blacklisted from the financial sector, and publicly disgraced. And then came the prison sentence. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison. Tax evasion carries another 5. Identity theft adds mandatory consecutive time. I was looking at decades behind bars. I would lose my youth, my freedom, and my future locked in a federal penitentiary while my parents sipped expensive wine in Calabasas. I sank to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The cold reality of my situation seeped into my bones. Jamal and Sienna had not just stolen money. They had meticulously constructed a cage around me, welded the bars shut, and handed the key to the federal government. They knew I had a pristine credit score and a flawless professional record. They exploited my hard-earned credibility to bypass the bank U.S. initial security checks, using my spotless reputation as a shield for their heist. The sheer helplessness was suffocating. I had no money to fight them. I had no family to support me. The public believed I was a mentally unstable, greedy monster who had terrorized her grieving parents. The federal government believed I was an international money launderer hiding millions offshore. I had absolutely no one in my corner. I buried my face in my hands, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack took hold. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, and black spots danced in my peripheral vision. For the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly broken. I had survived a lifetime of emotional neglect from my parents. I had endured their constant belittling, their obvious favoritism toward Sienna, and their dismissal of my achievements. I had built a successful independent life, despite their toxic influence. But this was different. This was total annihilation. They had finally won. They had crushed me into dust to pave their way to luxury. I was sitting on the floor of my dead grandfather's U.S. empty house, facing complete financial ruin and federal prison, while the people responsible for my destruction were being praised as victims by millions of strangers on the internet. The injustice of it all burned like acid in my throat. I had played by the rules my entire life. I paid my taxes, worked long hours, and built a respectable career, and my reward was to be the sacrificial lamb for a family of narcissistic parasites. I tried to imagine sitting in a sterile interrogation room facing federal prosecutors. I tried to imagine explaining to them that my sister-used crypto-obsessed husband had framed me while my mother cheered him on. It sounded absurd, even in my own head. Prosecutors do not deal in family excuses. They deal in digital signatures, IP logs, and offshore registrations. Jamal had made sure every single piece of digital evidence bore my name. I was a fraud investigator, and I had been outmaneuvered by a man who sold fake financial advice on social media. The professional humiliation stung almost as much as the personal betrayal. The silence of the gutted study amplified the sound of my ragged breathing. I was entirely out of options. I was staring down the barrel of a ruined life, waiting for the federal agents to arrive and place me in handcuffs. I leaned my head back against the cold, bare wall, letting the darkness swallow me whole, surrendering to the bitter truth that my family had finally managed to destroy me completely. I sat there in the shadows for what felt like hours, letting the cold seep into my bones. The rain continued to batter the glass, mirroring the relentless assault on my reality. I was so paralyzed by the looming federal indictment that I barely registered the sound of dress shoes clicking against the bare hardwood floor in the hallway. The heavy oak door of the study pushed open. Oliver stepped back into the room. He had been outside dealing with the moving crew, making sure they did not damage the remaining fixtures. He stopped in the center of the room, looking down at me huddled against the wall. He did not offer a hand to help me up. He did not offer hollow words of comfort. He knew better. He was a ruthless estate attorney who had spent decades navigating the darkest corners of human greed alongside my grandfather. Oliver reached inside his tailored breast pocket. He pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope, sealed with dark red wax, and a small, sleek silver USB drive. He walked over and placed both items precisely on the edge of my closed laptop. I looked up at him, my eyes bloodshot and stinging. "What is this?" I asked, my voice hoarse and broken. "Your grandfather was an exceptional judge of character," Oliver said quietly, his hands resting in his pockets. "He built an empire because he knew exactly how greedy, stupid, and predictable people could be. He knew your parents were waiting like vultures for him to draw his last breath. He knew Jamal fancied himself a criminal mastermind. But most importantly, he knew you." I slowly pushed myself off the floor, my joints aching from the tension. I reached for the heavy envelope. The wax seal bore the crest of my grandfather's U.S. signet ring. I broke the seal and pulled out the crisp, folded stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably his, sharp, precise, and unwavering, written with the fountain pen he always kept on his mahogany desk. I began to read. "My dearest Cassidy, if Oliver has given you this letter, it means I am gone and the jackals have made their move. Do not cry for me. I lived exactly the life I wanted. Instead, pay very close attention to what I am about to tell you. I knew Brenda and Richard would try to rob me blind the moment I was incapacitated. I watched your mother resent my wealth for decades waiting for her payday. I knew that arrogant crypto fool your sister married would try to orchestrate the theft to fund his pathetic lifestyle. And because I know them, I knew they would never have the courage to put their own names on the offshore accounts. They are cowards, Cassidy. I knew they would use your pristine identity as a shield. They thought they were outsmarting a dying old man. They thought they were setting you up to take the fall. I felt the breath catch in my throat. I read the next paragraph, my eyes darting rapidly across the ink. They did not steal anything I did not want them to steal. That $3 million retirement account was bait. It was a trap meticulously designed and laid out in the open for them to grab. I made it easy enough for a bribed notary to access, but complex enough under the surface to trigger an immediate federal response. You are the sharpest corporate fraud investigator I have ever seen. But your one weakness was always your misplaced hope that your parents would eventually love you. You kept letting them hurt you, hoping one day they would see your worth. I could not leave this earth knowing they would continue to drag you down. So I gave you the tools to sever the tie permanently. I stared at the paper. My grandfather had anticipated every single move Jamal and my parents had made. He had orchestrated the entire heist from his hospital bed, using his own money as the bait to catch them in a federal crime. The letter concluded with a final chilling directive. Inside the USB drive, you will find everything you need. Admin access, back-end tracking protocols, and the trapdoor I wired into the offshore account routing. They think they framed you, but they actually just walked into a federal snare. You are not the victim here, Cassidy. You are the executioner. Wipe your tears, plug in the drive, start hunting, my sweet. I read the final sentence 3 times. Start hunting. The sheer brilliance of my grandfather's final act washed over me, obliterating the panic that had crippled me minutes ago. He had not left me defenseless. He had given me a loaded weapon and the absolute moral permission to pull the trigger. My parents had spent my entire life making me feel small, ordinary, and useless. They had mocked my profession, telling everyone I just pushed boring papers around. They vastly underestimated exactly what I do for a living. I tracked down the smartest financial criminals in the world for a living, and Jamal was nothing but a sloppy amateur. I carefully folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. I reached up and wiped the dried tears from my cheeks. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The overwhelming sense of betrayal was replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I picked up the silver USB drive, feeling its cool metal against my palm. The crushing weight of isolation was gone. My grandfather was still with me, guiding my hand from beyond the grave. Oliver watched me intently. "Are you ready?" he asked, a faint, dangerous smile playing on his lips. I flipped my laptop open. The dark screen illuminated my face. "I am not going to federal prison," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. "I am going to tear their fake empire down to the foundation." I inserted the USB drive into the port. A decryption prompt immediately flashed on my screen. I was no longer the discarded daughter crying in an empty room. I was a licensed federal fraud examiner with all the keys to the kingdom. I cracked my knuckles and typed in my master password. The hunt was officially on. The encrypted drive loaded onto my screen, bypassing my standard corporate firewalls with a custom script my grandfather must have paid top-tier cybersecurity experts to write. A single master folder appeared on my desktop. It was simply labeled, "The Bait." I double-clicked the folder. Dozens of subdirectories instantly populated my screen, filled with banking protocols, routing numbers, and highly classified compliance documents. As my eyes scanned the file names, the sheer genius of my grandfather's final financial maneuver became terrifyingly clear. He had not just left a pile of money sitting in a vulnerable account. He had engineered a financial honeypot. In the cybersecurity and fraud investigation world, a honeypot is a trap. It is a system intentionally designed to look like a highly valuable, poorly secured target to lure in attackers. Once the attacker takes the bait, the system locks them inside, records their every move, and alerts the authorities. My grandfather had built the banking equivalent of a steel bear trap, disguised it as a vulnerable retirement fund, and left it wide open for my parents and Jamal to step into. I opened the core banking configuration file and began to read the source code of the account. A cold, triumphant smile slowly spread across my face. Oliver, I said, not taking my eyes off the glowing screen. Did my grandfather restructure his entire retirement portfolio to fall under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act before he went into the hospital? Oliver stepped closer, looking over my shoulder at the lines of data. He did. Oliver confirmed, his voice laced with dark satisfaction. He spent his last healthy month working with me to reclassify those specific $3 million. We locked them under the strictest federal reporting guidelines available in the United States banking system. The Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, is a federal law designed to target non-compliant taxpayers using foreign accounts. Usually it forces foreign banks to report back to the IRS. But my grandfather had weaponized it. He had attached invisible compliance flags directly to the funds themselves. I started pulling up the transaction logs the USB drive had actively captured during the heist. When Jamal initiated that $3 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands, he thought he was executing a standard offshore dump. He thought using my social security number and a fake limited liability company would create a privacy shield. He believed the decentralized finance tricks he bragged about on his podcasts would mask the movement of the money. He was incredibly, fatally wrong. Because of the FATCA compliance flags my grandfather had hard-coded into the account the moment Jamal hit send, the money did not just transfer. It detonated. The transaction was automatically classified as a high-risk, unauthorized offshore capital flight. Standard banking procedures would usually put a hold on the funds and call the account owner. But my grandfather had explicitly waived the holding period in his trap design. He wanted the money to leave the country. He wanted the crime to be fully executed. By allowing the wire to hit the clearinghouse in New York and cross international waters into the Cayman Islands, the trap elevated the crime from simple local theft to international wire fraud. I pulled up the exact federal statute on my screen. Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343. Wire fraud. It is one of the most severe financial crimes in the federal penal code. And because Jamal had moved the money across international borders to a known tax haven, he had simultaneously triggered severe IRS tax evasion protocols. The automated warning email I had received earlier from my bank was not a sign that my life was over. It was the system functioning exactly as my grandfather had designed it. The alarm bells were ringing at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division was already assembling a task force. The FBI White-Collar Crime Unit was officially mobilized. Jamal thought he was playing chess, but my grandfather had bolted him to the board and set the room on fire. But there was one piece of the puzzle I still needed to solve. The federal government currently thought I was the mastermind because my social security number was on the Cayman Islands shell company. If I went to the authorities with just this information, I would still have to endure a grueling investigation to prove my innocence. My family had spoofed my digital identity, and I needed to rip that mask off to show the feds exactly who was pulling the strings. I dug deeper into the honeypot files. My grandfather had thought of that too. The USB drive did not just contain the banking trap. It contained a backdoor tracking program embedded in the transaction receipt. When Jamal executed the wire transfer, the bank US server sent a confirmation packet back to his computer. Hidden inside that routine digital receipt was a packet sniffer. It bypassed his cheap commercial VPN. It ignored his encrypted browser. It went straight to the hardware. I opened the tracking log. There it was, the golden ticket. The honeypot had captured the exact media access control address, the unique hardware identifier of the physical laptop used to steal the money. It had captured the true IP address of the router the laptop was connected to. I ran the IP address through a geolocation database. A map appeared on my screen, dropping a bright red pin directly onto a residential street in Los Angeles, California. It was not a coffee shop. It was not a public library. The IP address belonged to a private luxury short-term rental property. I tapped the desk, my mind working at lightning speed. My parents, Sienna and Jamal, were currently in the Bahamas. But before they left, they had to execute the wire transfer. They needed a secure location. They had rented a house in Los Angeles to stage the theft, secure the Calabasas mansion deal, and then immediately flee to the Caribbean to establish an alibi while the money moved offshore. I turned back to Oliver, the final pieces of the puzzle locking perfectly into place. They used an IP address in Los Angeles to forge my signature and authorize the wire I told him, pointing at the red pin on my screen. Jamal used his own personal laptop to do it. The honeypot captured his device, us exact digital fingerprint. The FBI does not need to guess who pushed the button. I have the digital murder weapon, and it has Jamal U.S. fingerprints all over it. Oliver let out a slow, heavy breath. The tension that had been gripping his shoulders finally began to release. Your grandfather always said you were the only one in the family who inherited his teeth, Oliver said softly. He knew you would find the tracking data. He knew you would know exactly what to do with it. My family thought they had left me with nothing. They thought they had saddled me with a catastrophic federal indictment while they sailed through crystal clear waters, spending millions of dollars that did not belong to them. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that their perfect crime was actually a perfectly constructed cage. I had the complete unredacted compliance logs. I had the FOTCA trigger reports. I had the hardware identification of the exact computer used to commit international wire fraud. I had everything I needed to shift the crosshairs of the United States federal government directly off my back and plant them squarely onto my family. I closed the tracking window and opened a fresh, secure email server. It was time to introduce Jamal, Sienna, Brenda, and Richard to the brutal, unforgiving reality of federal law enforcement. I stared at the secure email client blinking on my screen. Before I could send this to my federal contacts, I needed the final undeniable piece of the puzzle. I had the hardware identifier and the general Los Angeles IP address from my grandfather, U.S. honeypot. But a slick defense attorney could still argue that anyone could have stolen my identity and used a random laptop in Southern California. I needed to tie the digital signature on the wire transfer directly to Jamal U.S. physical hands. I accessed the encrypted metadata attached to the power of attorney and the Cayman Islands Incorporation documents. When you sign a legally binding digital document, the software does not just capture a picture of your signature. It records a cryptographic hash, a precise timestamp, and the exact internet protocol address of the network you are connected to. Jamal thought he was brilliant for using my name and my social security number, but he fundamentally misunderstood how digital forensics work. I ran a specialized traceroute on the IP address embedded in the digital signature. It bypassed the cheap commercial VPN node Jamal had rented and pinged straight back to the original internet service provider. It was a dedicated fiber optic line. I opened a secondary terminal on my laptop and tapped into a property and utility database that fraud investigators use to verify corporate addresses. I cross-referenced the ISP node with the geographic coordinates. The search results populated instantly. The IP address did not belong to a coffee shop or a short-term rental, like I initially suspected. The internet service was registered to a permanent residential address in Calabasas, California. I recognized the zip code immediately. It was the ultra-exclusive gated community that Sienna had been teasing on her social media for months. I pulled up the utility registration for that specific address. The internet account had been activated exactly 14 days ago. The account holder U.S. name was printed right there in black and white on my screen. Jamal. I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. The sheer arrogance of this man was breathtaking. He had put down a deposit on a multi-million-dollar Calabasas mansion using the very funds he was in the process of stealing. And then he had sat inside that same mansion, connected his laptop to his own personal newly installed home Wi-Fi network, and executed an international wire fraud using my stolen identity. He actually believed that routing the money through a Cayman Islands shell company would magically scrub his physical location from the internet. He was a textbook crypto bro high on digital buzzwords, but entirely ignorant of basic network security protocols. I needed to nail the coffin shut. I looked at the exact timestamp on the digital signature. The wire transfer was executed at precisely 10:14 p.m. Pacific Time on Tuesday. I opened my personal work portal and checked my own location data. At 10:14 p.m. on Tuesday, I was sitting in my firm U.S. Seattle office. My corporate keycard had swiped into the secure server room at 9:40 p.m., and I did not swipe out until 11:30 p.m. My firm has high-definition security cameras covering every inch of that server room. I had an airtight, federally verifiable alibi proving I was 1,000 miles away when the transfer was authorized. But I wanted to make the federal prosecutor U.S. job completely effortless. I picked up my phone and went straight to Sienna U.S. Instagram page. I scrolled back to Tuesday night. Sure enough, my sister could never resist the urge to brag for her followers. At exactly 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday, mere minutes after the wire transfer was pushed through, Sienna had posted a photo of her and Jamal standing in the grand foyer of a massive empty house. Jamal was holding up a bottle of expensive champagne, and Sienna was dangling a set of house keys. The caption read, "Big moves behind the scenes. Our new Calabasas dream home is officially secured." They had literally documented their own crime scene. I downloaded the high-resolution photo, extracted the metadata from the image, and matched the GPS coordinates perfectly to the Calabasas address on the utility bill. I had them. I had the fraudulent wire transfer, the federal compliance trigger logs from my grandfather, U.S. Honeypot, the IP address, matching Jamal's newly activated internet service, my own airtight corporate alibi, and a photographic confession uploaded by my own sister. I turned the laptop screen toward Oliver so he could see the compiled dossier. "Look at this," I said, pointing at the timeline mapped out on my display. Jamal sat in his new mansion, used his own personal Wi-Fi, and transferred $3 million into a shell company with my name on it. He left a digital trail so wide a blindfolded rookie could follow it. Oliver adjusted his glasses, leaning in to study the screen. His expression shifted from solemn grief to a look of predatory satisfaction. "Your grandfather always called Jamal a peacock," Oliver noted quietly. "All flashy feathers and absolute zero substance. He assumed Jamal would make a mistake, but this is a masterclass in stupidity. It is a gift," I corrected him. "A gift I am about to hand-deliver to the United States government. I am not going to use the public tip line. I am going to bypass the bureaucracy entirely. During my years investigating corporate embezzlement, I have built direct relationships with senior federal agents. I have a reliable contact at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in Washington and another at the FBI White Collar Crime Unit in Los Angeles. They know my work. They trust my data. When I send them a fully packaged, ready-to-prosecute federal fraud case, they do not put it in a queue. They mobilize a strike team." I began dragging the files into an encrypted password-protected zip folder. Every piece of evidence was meticulously labeled and cross-referenced. The narrative of the crime was perfectly laid out, completely exonerating me and shifting the absolute focus of the federal government directly onto the Calabasas mansion. The trap my grandfather envisioned was fully armed. All I had to do was hand the leash over to the feds and watch my family-us fake empire crumble into dust. I attached the encrypted zip folder to a secure email addressed directly to my top contacts at the FBI White Collar Crime Division and the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit. I did not write a long emotional message. Federal agents do not care about family drama or broken childhoods. They care about actionable intelligence. My message was brief and clinical. It stated that the attached dossier contained irrefutable proof of a $3 million international wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and active money laundering, complete with hardware identifiers and GPS coordinates of the perpetrators. I hovered my cursor over the send button. A lesser person might have paused. A weaker daughter might have picked up the phone, called her parents, and screamed at them, giving them a chance to panic, hire a defense attorney, and destroy evidence. But I was done being the weak, hopeful daughter they could walk all over. I did not want apologies. I wanted convictions. I clicked send. The progress bar flashed green and the email vanished into the secure federal server. I did not call my family to warn them. I let the silence be my weapon. While I waited for the federal agencies to digest the massive bomb I had just dropped into their laps, I turned my attention back to my sister US Instagram feed. If Jamal was the architect of the digital fraud, Sienna was the architect of their physical downfall. She simply could not stop broadcasting their crimes to the world. To build an airtight case for federal asset forfeiture, prosecutors need to prove that the suspects are actively consuming the illicit funds. Sienna was practically doing the prosecutor's job for them. I opened a forensic screen recording software and began archiving every single piece of content she uploaded. She posted a video from a high-end boutique in Nassau, swiping a black credit card to purchase 3 designer handbags. The caption read, "Retail therapy is the best grief counseling." I archived it. Next was a boomerang video of Jamal sitting on the deck of their chartered yacht, snapping a diamond-encrusted Rolex onto his wrist. He looked directly into the camera and said, "Crypto gains never sleep." I archived it. Then came a highly produced reel showing off the architectural renderings and virtual tour of the Calabasas mansion they had just put into escrow. She tagged the luxury real estate brokerage and added a dozen hashtags about generational wealth and manifesting your dream life. Every champagne bottle they popped, every designer label they flaunted, every sunset, yacht cruise they documented was permanently logged into my evidence file. They were creating a real-time, publicly accessible receipt of their money laundering operation. Under United States federal law, spending money obtained through wire fraud to purchase real estate or luxury goods constitutes concealment and consumption of illicit proceeds. It meant the government could immediately seize the Calabasas mansion, the watches, the bags, and every single cent left in their accounts the moment the indictments were unsealed. They thought they were flexing on their haters. They were actually just inventorying their soon-to-be seized assets for the federal government. 35 minutes after I sent the email, my secure work phone vibrated against the hardwood floor. The caller ID displayed a Washington, D.C. area code. I picked it up on the first ring. Cassidy, a deep, no-nonsense voice, spoke on the other end. It was Special Agent Reynolds from the FBI, joined on a conference line by Inspector Hayes from the IRS. "Reynolds," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Did you review the packet?" "We are looking at it right now on a secured monitor," Inspector Hayes interjected, his voice laced with professional astonishment. "Cassidy, the FATCA compliance flags on that Cayman account were already screaming at our automated systems an hour ago. We were literally drafting a subpoena for your bank records because your social security number was on the shell company. We thought you had gone rogue." I leaned back against the wall of the empty study. I would never be that sloppy, Hayes. You know my work. My brother-in-law spoofed my identity to open the LLC, but he used his own personal residential IP address in Calabasas to execute the wire. I included my corporate security logs, proving I was physically in my Seattle office when the transaction occurred. "I see the hardware access control logs right here," Agent Reynolds confirmed, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing in the background of the call. "This is incredible. He really executed a multi-million-dollar international wire fraud from a traceable residential node. He believes decentralized finance makes him invisible," I explained coldly. "He is a crypto investor who thinks federal banking regulations do not apply to him. Furthermore, my sister is currently documenting their consumption of the stolen funds on Instagram. They are in the Bahamas right now buying luxury goods and celebrating the purchase of a Calabasas estate using the stolen retirement funds. I have archived all her posts. I will forward the supplementary file for your asset forfeiture division." There was a brief silence on the line as the 2 seasoned federal agents processed the sheer magnitude of my family U.S. stupidity. Cassidy Reynolds finally said, his tone shifting into absolute federal authority. "This is a remarkably tight package. We have clear evidence of Title 18 wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and tax evasion. Because they crossed international borders with stolen funds exceeding $1 million, we can fast-track this straight to a federal grand jury. We are coordinating with the Los Angeles field office to put eyes on that Calabasas property immediately." "Are they a flight risk?" Hayes asked. "They are currently out of the country." "No," I answered confidently. They are arrogant, not cautious. Sienna posted that they are flying back to Los Angeles next week to host a massive housewarming party at the new mansion. They fully believe they got away with it. They will walk right back onto American soil. Perfect, Reynolds stated. We will flag their passports, but we will let them clear customs unhindered. If they want to throw a party in a house bought with laundered money, we will make sure we are on the guest list. Cassidy, you need to maintain absolute radio silence with them. Do not confront them. Do not warn them. Let them believe the illusion is intact. I am not going to say a single word, I assured him. I want them to feel as untouchable as possible, right until the moment you kick their door off the hinges. We ended the call. The federal machine was officially in motion. The trap had snapped shut and there was absolutely no way out. The FBI and the IRS were now quietly mobilizing their resources, drafting the warrants, and preparing to seize everything my family claimed to own. I set my phone down next to the laptop and let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had been fueling me for the last 2 hours began to level out, leaving a deep, resonant calm in its wake. I had done it. I had cleared my name and sealed their fate. Oliver, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the study, listening to my entire side of the phone call, slowly stood up. He walked over to the window looking out at the Seattle rain that was finally beginning to slow. He turned back to me, a profound sense of respect etched into his weathered features. You execute your work with a terrifying precision, Cassidy, Oliver noted, adjusting his tie. Your grandfather was absolutely right about you. You did not just stop them. You obliterated them. I closed the lid of my laptop. They left me no other choice, Oliver. They tried to put me in a federal prison to buy a house. I am just returning the favor. Oliver nodded slowly, a knowing glint in his eye. Well, now that the unpleasant business of the decoy money is fully sorted out, he said, reaching into his interior jacket pocket once again, I believe it is time we discuss your actual inheritance. I frowned, looking up at him in confusion. My actual inheritance? I just watched them steal $3 million. That was his retirement fund. What else could possibly be left? Oliver let out a low, rumbling chuckle. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound legal folio that he had kept hidden on his person this entire time. Cassidy, Oliver said, stepping forward and placing the heavy folio on top of my closed laptop. Your grandfather was a titan of industry for 40 years. Do you honestly believe his entire net worth was a measly $3 million sitting in a liquid checking account? That money was just the cheese in the mousetrap. It is time you saw the real will. I stared at the heavy leather folio resting on my laptop. The words Oliver had just spoken echoed in the cold, empty space of the gutted study. The real will. My mind, already racing from the adrenaline of executing the federal honeypot trap, momentarily stalled. I looked from the folio to Oliver's calm, weathered face. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I just saw the bank statements. They took $3 million. That was his entire retirement portfolio. Oliver unfastened the brass clasp of the leather folio with slow, deliberate precision. He did not pull out a single sheet of paper. Instead, he withdrew a dense, meticulously organized stack of legal contracts, all bound by heavy blue legal tape and stamped with corporate seals. Your grandfather was a man who deeply understood the value of misdirection, Oliver said, smoothing his hand over the top document. He knew that Brenda and Richard lacked the financial literacy to look past a liquid checking account. To them, $3 million in cash is the ultimate prize. It is flashy. It is immediate. It is exactly the kind of shiny object that catches the eye of a greedy, desperate thief. Oliver leaned forward, tapping the stack of documents. But wealth, true generational wealth, is rarely kept in cash, Cassidy. Your grandfather spent the last 40 years acquiring commercial real estate, office buildings in downtown Seattle, logistics warehouses near the port, a high-end retail complex in Bellevue. Real tangible revenue-generating assets, not volatile crypto tokens, not flashy mansions meant for Instagram photos. Real power. I looked down at the documents, my investigative instincts kicking back in. I reached out and opened the first page. It was a declaration of trust, While your parents were busy complaining about their credit card debt and fawning over Sienna U.S. social media follower count, Oliver continued, his voice echoing with profound respect. Your grandfather and I were busy structuring a blind corporate proxy. We took his entire commercial real estate portfolio and transferred it into an irrevocable anonymous trust. I scanned the legal jargon rapidly. As a fraud investigator, I deal with corporate structures daily. A blind trust of this caliber is the ultimate financial fortress. It meant the assets were completely shielded from public record. They would never go through probate court. They would never be listed in a public will. As far as the federal government, the IRS, and the general public were concerned, these properties were owned by a faceless corporate entity. What is the valuation of this portfolio? I asked, my eyes darting across the pages looking for the bottom line. Oliver adjusted his glasses. The current appraised value of the trust portfolio is precisely $15 million. It generates a net operating income of roughly $1.2 million annually. I stopped breathing. $15 million. My parents had sacrificed my freedom, forged legal documents, and committed international wire fraud to steal $3 million they thought was my grandfather, used entire life savings. They had literally sold their souls for the bait. Meanwhile, the actual fortune, an empire 5 times that size, had been quietly secured behind an impenetrable legal wall. And because the trust is completely anonymous and irrevocable, Oliver said, a sharp, satisfied smile crossing his face, Brenda and Richard cannot contest it. They cannot sue for a piece of it. They cannot even hire a lawyer to demand an audit. Why? Because they have absolutely no idea it exists. They will spend the rest of their lives fighting federal indictments over the $3 million honeypot, completely oblivious to the fact that the real treasure is sitting safely right here in this room. He reached into the folio and pulled out the final page. It was the beneficiary designation form. Your grandfather saw exactly who you were, Cassidy, Oliver said softly, the harshness leaving his voice. He saw how they treated you. He saw them praise Sienna for doing nothing while you worked 80-hour weeks to build a respectable career. He knew you would never ask him for a dime, so he made sure you would never have to. I looked down at the beneficiary line. There was only one name listed, Cassidy. I was the sole, undisputed, and exclusive heir to a $15 million commercial real estate empire. Tears pricked my eyes, but this time they were not tears of anger or betrayal. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. My grandfather had not just protected me from their fraud. He had actively secured my entire future. He had given me a level of financial independence and power that my parents could never even comprehend, let alone touch. Sign here, Oliver instructed, handing me a heavy gold fountain pen, the exact pen my grandfather always used. By signing this, you formally accept your position as the primary trustee and sole beneficiary. The properties, the revenue streams, the corporate protections, they all transfer to your direct control immediately. I took the pen. My hand was entirely steady. I did not hesitate. I pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed my name on the dotted line. With that single stroke of ink, the transition was complete. I went from being a targeted victim, facing a fabricated federal indictment, to a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate mogul in the span of a single afternoon. Oliver gathered the documents and placed them carefully back into the leather folio. He handed the entire package to me. It is yours now, Cassidy. Your grandfather wanted you to build a life where you never had to answer to anyone ever again, especially not them. I held the heavy folio against my chest. The weight of it was grounding. It felt like armor. What happens now? Oliver asked, stepping back and looking at me with an expression of quiet anticipation. I looked out the window. The Seattle rain had finally stopped, and the heavy gray clouds were beginning to break, letting sharp rays of sunlight pierce through the gloom. My parents, Sienna and Jamal, were currently partying on a yacht in the Bahamas, drunk on stolen money and their own monumental arrogance. They believed they were the untouchable elites. They believed they had won. In 2 weeks, they are throwing a massive housewarming party at their new Calabasas mansion. I said, my voice ringing with absolute ice-cold certainty. They are going to invite every influencer, every relative, and every business partner they want to impress. They are going to pop expensive champagne and celebrate their fake generational wealth. I turned back to Oliver, picking up my encrypted laptop. I am going to let them have their fun, I told him, a hard, predatory smile forming on my lips. I am going to let them put on their best clothes, turn on their cameras, and smile for their millions of followers. And then I am going to walk right through their front doors and watch the United States government take everything away from them. The trap was set. The bait was taken. The real legacy was secure in my hands. All that was left to do was wait for the hammer to fall. 2 weeks passed exactly as I anticipated. The federal agencies operated with silent, lethal efficiency behind closed doors, while my family operated with loud, reckless arrogance in the public eye. They had returned from their Caribbean vacation completely convinced they had pulled off the perfect crime. They believed the Cayman Islands Shell Company was an impenetrable fortress and that I was sitting in Seattle paralyzed by the fear of a federal tax audit. They were so intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance that they immediately threw a massive housewarming party at their newly acquired Calabasas estate. I pulled my modest sedan up to the towering wrought iron gates of the ultra-exclusive neighborhood. The sprawling driveway of the mansion was already clogged with matte black Lamborghinis, neon-wrapped G-Wagons, and heavily modified luxury SUVs. A valet in a crisp white uniform took my keys, barely glancing at me. I did not fit the aesthetic of the evening. The guest list was entirely composed of flashy social media influencers, aggressive crypto investors, and the same hypocritical relatives who had flooded my phone with hateful text messages. They were all dressed in sparkling designer gowns and velvet smoking jackets. I, on the other hand, was wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal gray business suit. I was not dressed for a Hollywood celebration. I was dressed for a forensic audit. I walked through the massive custom oak front doors, stepping onto imported white marble floors that gleamed under the light of a cascading crystal chandelier. The sheer scale of the mansion was grotesque. It featured floating glass staircases, a 2-story indoor waterfall, and floor-to-ceiling windows that completely opened up to a backyard oasis. A prominent DJ was stationed on a floating platform over the infinity pool, blasting heavy bass that rattled the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of expensive catered hors d'oeuvres, premium cigars, and pure unfiltered entitlement. I stood near the edge of the grand foyer, letting the shadows of a large indoor palm tree conceal me as I surveyed the room. The entire party was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. By the edge of the glowing infinity pool, Sienna was holding court. She had hired a professional videography crew to document the party for her lifestyle brand. She was wearing a custom backless silk gown that easily cost $10,000. I watched her look directly into a camera lens, tossing her perfectly styled hair and placing a hand over her heart. She was practically shouting over the music to ensure her millions of followers could hear her. "We just manifested this beautiful energy." Sienna beamed, spinning around to showcase the sprawling estate behind her. "This house is a testament to what happens when you protect your peace, cut out toxic people, and focus purely on generational wealth. I am so blessed to share this journey with you guys. Hard work truly pays off." I felt a dark, cynical smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Hard work. She was standing on marble floors paid for by a forged signature. The catering staff serving her guests were funded by my grandfather, U.S. stolen retirement accounts. She had monetized a felony. A few feet away from Sienna, Jamal was leaning against the outdoor marble bar surrounded by a group of equally obnoxious crypto bros. He was smoking a thick Cuban cigar and wearing a tailored suit jacket with no shirt underneath, showcasing the heavy diamond chains resting on his chest. He was gesturing wildly, holding a glass of ridiculously expensive cognac. "I am telling you, man, traditional finance is dead," Jamal boasted loudly to his captivated audience. "You have to know how to leverage offshore assets. I took a chunk of seed capital a few weeks ago, ran it through a decentralized protocol, and boom, we closed on this estate in cash. No mortgages, no banks asking stupid questions. You just have to be the smartest guy in the room and take what is yours. He was literally bragging about international money laundering to a crowd of people. He was so blindingly arrogant that he viewed his sloppy, easily traceable wire fraud as a stroke of financial genius. I shifted my gaze back inside the massive living room. And there they were, Brenda and Richard, my parents. It had been barely 3 weeks since my grandfather Brenda, U.S. own father, had died. Yet there was absolutely no sign of mourning. Brenda was wearing a sparkling emerald evening gown and a diamond necklace that caught the light with her every movement. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back as she held a glass of Dom Perignon. Richard stood beside her, wearing a custom tuxedo, nodding along as if he were the patriarch of an old money dynasty, rather than a man drowning in credit card debt who had just robbed a dying man on his deathbed. What made the scene even more repulsive was the company they were keeping. Clustered around my parents were Aunt Margaret, cousin David, and several other extended family members. These were the exact same people who had texted me vile insults, calling me a greedy psychopath and a jealous failure. Now they were eagerly sipping free champagne and kissing up to Brenda and Richard, completely mesmerized by the illusion of massive wealth. "I love the new necklace," Brenda Aunt Margaret gushed, reaching out to touch the diamonds resting on my mother-us collarbone. "You and Richard deserve this luxury. After all the stress Cassidy put you through, it is so wonderful to see you finally relaxing and enjoying your inheritance." Brenda sighed dramatically, playing the role of the exhausted, benevolent mother to perfection. "Thank you, Margaret. It has been a nightmare dealing with her mental instability. But we decided we could not let her toxic jealousy ruin our lives anymore. We had to claim our blessing and move forward." I stood in the shadows, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic calm. There was no anger left in me. Anger is an unpredictable emotion, and I needed absolute precision for what was about to happen. I watched them revel in their stolen glory. Every clinking glass, every boastful laugh, every flashing camera was just another piece of evidence confirming their consumption of illicit funds. They were dancing on my grandfather-us grave, wearing his life savings on their wrists and necks, entirely oblivious to the federal crosshairs painted squarely on their foreheads. The music pulsed through the floorboards. The party was at its absolute peak. The illusion of their fake empire was flawless, glittering, and seemingly untouchable. I stepped out from behind the palm tree and walked directly into the blinding light of the grand foyer. It was time to pull the plug. I walked straight through the center of the massive room. My dark gray business suit cut a stark, uncompromising line through the sea of pastel silks, shimmering sequins, and velvet jackets. I did not look up at the cascading crystal chandelier or the extravagant indoor waterfall. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the gathering near the center marble island. The ripple effect of my presence was immediate. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned. Aunt Margaret saw me first. She gasped loudly, spilling a drop of expensive champagne onto her wrist. Brenda followed her sister-us gaze. The transition on my mother-us face was instantaneous and spectacular to witness. The radiant, benevolent matriarch vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a rigid mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. But true to her narcissistic nature, she quickly masked her terror with self-righteous outrage. Brenda marched toward me, her emerald gown swishing furiously against the polished marble floor. Richard trailed right behind her, his posture stiffening, as if preparing for a physical altercation. The surrounding guests, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere and smelling drama, formed a wide circle around us. "What on earth are you doing here?" Brenda hissed, keeping her voice low but venomous, so the guests would not hear her losing control. "This is a private event. You were not invited. Security should have never let you pass the gate." "I have a very pressing delivery," I said smoothly, holding a thick manila folder at my side. "Get out!" Brenda commanded, gesturing sharply toward the heavy oak front doors. "I am not going to let you ruin your sister a special night with your insane, jealous delusions. Someone call security right now. Get this crazy woman out of my house." Hearing the commotion, Sienna strutted over from the pool deck, flanked immediately by Jamal. Sienna held her smartphone up high, the camera lens pointed directly at my face. She was already recording. Cassidy, stop! Sienna pleaded loudly, putting on her absolute best victim voice for her digital audience. Please do not do this. We just want peace. Why are you stalking us? You need to leave before you have another mental breakdown. Jamal stepped in front of Sienna, puffing out his chest and crossing his muscular arms. You heard her. Turn around and walk out that door before I have you physically thrown out, sis. You are embarrassing yourself in front of our guests. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I did not shrink away from the camera lens pointed at my face. I simply smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm, calculated smile. I stepped right past Jamal, ignoring his physical posturing entirely, and walked directly up to the massive marble island in the center of the room. With a swift, deliberate sweep of my arm, I pushed aside a silver tray of caviar and two half-empty champagne flutes. The crystal clattered loudly against the stone, silencing the remaining chatter in the room. Even the DJ outside seemed to lower the music. I slammed the thick manila dossier down onto the marble. The heavy thud echoed sharply, cutting through the ambient noise of the party. I am not here to crash your party, Jamal, I said, my voice carrying the crisp, authoritative cadence of a federal investigator delivering a subpoena. I am here to deliver a courtesy copy of the forensic audit report I just handed over to the United States Department of the Treasury. Brenda scoffed, though her manicured hands were visibly shaking. What absolute nonsense are you talking about now? I tapped the cover of the dossier with my index finger. This audit shows exactly how $3 million moved from my grandfather's U.S. retirement account to a Cayman Islands shell company. It shows the forged medical power of attorney you and Richard signed while he was lying in a coma. But more importantly, it shows the digital footprint of the wire transfer. I turned my gaze to Jamal. The arrogant smirk had completely vanished from his face. You thought you were a genius for using my social security number, I told him, speaking loudly enough for the surrounding crowd of influencers and relatives to hear every single word. You thought registering the offshore limited liability company in my name would make me the primary target for the IRS. But you forgot that digital signatures capture the exact Internet Protocol address of the device used to sign them. You do not understand how basic network security works. Jamal took a step back, his eyes darting toward the front door. The audit proves the signature did not come from my encrypted computer in Seattle. I continued relentlessly. It came from a newly activated residential IP address right here in Southern California. It came from the router sitting inside this exact house, Jamal. You used the IP address of this Calabasas property to forge my signature and move stolen funds across international borders. I turned back to my mother, locking eyes with her. That is federal wire fraud, Mother, and using my credentials to execute the transfer is aggravated identity theft. The silence inside the grand foyer was deafening. Aunt Margaret and Cousin David were staring at Brenda in absolute horror. The illusion of their massive wealth was dissolving right in front of their eyes. Sienna slowly lowered her phone, her thumb scrambling to stop the recording. The soft girl influencer facade cracked, revealing the terrified, complicit accomplice underneath. Jamal's chest completely deflated. He looked at the thick dossier on the marble counter, then at me, the reality of his massive technical blunder finally piercing his inflated ego. You are bluffing, Richard spoke up, his voice cracking with desperation. You do not have access to those banking records. They are sealed. I did not need access, I replied, my eyes shifting to my father. Grandpa Harrison gave it to me. He knew exactly what you thieves were going to do. He reclassified that entire retirement fund under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act before he went to the hospital. He turned his own money into a federal honeypot. The moment Jamal hit send on that wire transfer, he triggered an automatic alert to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. You did not steal his money. You just tripped his alarm. Brenda backed away from the marble island, shaking her head frantically. No, that is impossible. You are making this up because you are jealous. We protected our peace. We bought this house legally with crypto investments. You bought this house with laundered money, I corrected her, my tone devoid of any sympathy or familial warmth. And you invited 100 people here tonight to document yourselves consuming those illicit funds. The IRS Asset Forfeiture Division thanks you for the meticulous inventory of your assets. The crowd of guests began to murmur, stepping away from my family as if they were suddenly contagious. The wealthy influencers and social climbers who had been kissing up to my mother just 5 minutes ago were now frantically looking for the nearest exit, desperate to distance themselves from a massive federal financial scandal. Brenda opened her mouth to scream for security, but the words died in her throat. The heavy, customized oak front doors of the mansion did not just open. They were shoved wide open by a force that made the hinges groan. Jamal ignored the sound of the groaning wood. His survival instinct had entirely bypassed logic and defaulted directly to his oversized ego. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us, his massive frame attempting to physically intimidate me into backing down. He snatched his smartphone from his pocket, his thick fingers frantically swiping across the screen to open Instagram Live. He shoved the camera lens mere inches from my face, his chest heaving with desperate, aggressive energy. "Look at this crazy stalker," Jamal shouted into his phone, his voice echoing over the confused murmurs of the crowd. "We are out here celebrating success, and my psychotic sister-in-law breaks into my secure property. I am exposing you right now, Cassidy. You hear me? You are going live to millions of people. I am going to show the whole world how mentally unstable you are. Security is coming to drag your jealous broke self out of my mansion." I did not flinch. I did not raise a hand to block his camera. I looked dead into the lens of his phone and delivered a smile so chilling it made Jamal visibly swallow hard. He was trying to build a digital shield out of his followers, firmly believing that internet clout could somehow alter physical reality. He honestly thought his wealth and his audience made him invincible. "That is not security, Jamal," I said softly, keeping my eyes locked on his camera. "Turn around." The massive oak doors slammed against the interior marble walls with a concussive crash that shook the grand foyer. Jamal whipped around his phone, still recording. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. It was not the private neighborhood security team in their polite polo shirts. It was a synchronized, overwhelming wave of federal authority. Over 24 heavily armed tactical agents flooded through the entryway, their boots stomping against the pristine white marble. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision, fanning out across the grand foyer and instantly sealing every possible exit. They were wearing dark tactical vests. Across their chests and backs, large yellow letters spelled out the only acronyms that strike absolute terror into the hearts of financial criminals: FBI and IRSCI. The party instantly descended into pure, unadulterated chaos. The DJ on the floating platform outside abruptly killed the music, leaving a ringing silence that was immediately shattered by the screams of terrified guests. High-profile influencers dropped their crystal champagne flutes, the glass shattering across the imported stone floors. Aides and managers scrambled toward the back doors, only to find stern-faced federal agents already locking down the perimeter. Nobody was allowed to leave. The ultimate VIP guest list was now a detained pool of witnesses. "Nobody move. Federal agents. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them." A commanding voice boomed over the panic. Special Agent Reynolds stepped through the parting sea of tactical officers. He looked exactly how he sounded on the phone, sharp, relentless, and entirely immune to the flashy distractions of Calabasas wealth. He was flanked by Inspector Hayes from the Internal Revenue Service, a man holding a thick stack of federal warrants secured to a heavy clipboard. Aunt Margaret let out a piercing shriek and stumbled backward, completely abandoning Brenda. Cousin David threw his hands in the air, practically sprinting away from my parents as if their sudden criminality was an infectious disease. The very same relatives who had sent me vile, threatening text messages defending my mother were now fighting each other to put as much physical distance between themselves and the central marble island as possible. Sienna was frozen by the indoor waterfall, her custom silk gown dripping with splashed water. The fake, vulnerable influencer persona had entirely evaporated, replaced by the raw, ugly reality of a 29-year-old woman realizing her entire life was over. She dropped her phone, the device clattering onto the wet stone, completely forgotten. Agent Reynolds marched straight toward the center of the room. He did not look at the expensive artwork. He did not look at the terrified celebrities huddled in the corners. He looked directly at the four people standing near the caviar tray. Richard and Brenda Reynolds barked, his voice projecting across the silent, breathless room. Sienna and Jamal, step away from the counter and place your hands behind your backs. Brenda let out a guttural, hyperventilating sob. There is a misunderstanding, she shrieked, her voice cracking, as two female FBI agents grabbed her arms and slammed them behind her back. We are innocent. My daughter did this. She is a fraud investigator. She framed us. Save it for a federal judge, Reynolds replied coldly. He pulled a rolled document from his jacket. We have a federal warrant for your arrest authorized by the United States District Court. You are being charged with Title 18 United States Code Section 1343 International Wire Fraud. You are also being charged with aggravated identity theft, money laundering, and tax evasion. Jamal tried to pull away from the agent, grabbing his shoulder. The heavy diamond chains around his neck swung wildly. I want a lawyer! Jamal yelled, his tough guy facade completely crumbling into sheer panic. You cannot do this. I bought this house in cash. I am a legitimate investor. Inspector Hayes stepped up to Jamal, entirely unbothered by his struggling. You bought this house with $3 million of stolen retirement funds, routed through a Cayman Islands shell company, Hayes stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Every asset on this property, including the property itself, is currently being seized by the United States Treasury under federal civil asset forfeiture laws. Your accounts are frozen. Your crypto wallets are locked. You do not own anything. The click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the room. Click, 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 click. 4 pairs of cuffs. 4 ruined lives. I stood perfectly still, watching the polished, untouchable facade of my family shatter into a million jagged pieces. Brenda was sobbing uncontrollably, the emerald green evening gown looking ridiculous against the harsh reality of her arrest. Richard was staring blankly at the floor, his face pale and sagging, completely broken. Sienna was shrieking, screaming at the agents not to touch her expensive dress, begging the guests to stop filming her humiliation. But the guests were absolutely recording. The influencers Jamal and Sienna had invited to showcase their fake empire were now live streaming their federal arrests to millions of followers across the globe. The ultimate social media flex had turned into a globally broadcast criminal takedown. Agent Reynolds locked eyes with me across the Marble Island. He gave a single respectful nod. I nodded back. The explosive payoff I had meticulously engineered was complete. The federal snare had closed and justice was finally served. The echo of the heavy steel handcuffs seemed to break the spell that had held the room captive. As the reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence finally penetrated Jamal, U.S. thick skull, the arrogant crypto bro facade completely evaporated. He was no longer the untouchable mastermind of decentralized finance. He was just a terrified man wearing a ridiculous unbuttoned jacket, standing in the ruins of a house he did not actually own. A tactical agent grabbed Jamal by the bicep to lead him toward the front doors. Jamal violently dug his custom loafers into the marble floor, twisting his body to face Special Agent Reynolds. Wait! Wait! You have the wrong person! Jamal screamed, the sheer panic causing his voice to crack perfectly an octave higher. I am not the mastermind here. I just pushed the buttons. It was her idea. Jamal thrust his cuffed hands awkwardly in the direction of his wife. Sienna flinched as if he had just struck her. She gave me the social security number, Jamal bellowed, completely throwing his wife under the proverbial federal bus, without a single second of hesitation. Sienna told me to forge her sister a signature. She said Cassidy was a weak, pathetic loser who would never fight back. Sienna was desperate for this Calabasas house to keep up with her influencer friends. She manipulated me into executing the wire transfer. I am just a legitimate investor. She is the one who wanted to steal from the old man. The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd of influencers was loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling. Dozens of smartphones were thrust higher into the air, camera lenses zooming in to capture every millisecond of the marital betrayal. Ring lights were suddenly flipped on. Camera flashes illuminated the grand foyer with rapid, blinding bursts of white light. Nobody stepped forward to defend Sienna or Jamal. The attendees were digital vampires eagerly sucking up the drama for their own engagement metrics. Sienna's mouth fell open in absolute shock. The delicate soft girl influencer who had just built a massive digital brand on protecting her peace and cutting out toxic energy transformed instantly into a feral, cornered animal. "You lying, broke, pathetic loser!" Sienna shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the indoor waterfall. The pristine white silk of her designer gown slipped off one shoulder as she lunged toward her husband, only to be yanked back roughly by a female FBI agent. "Tell them the truth, Jamal," Sienna roared, the veins bulging in her neck. "Tell the federal agents how your stupid crypto portfolio completely tanked last month. You were drowning in margin calls. You begged me to find a way to get cash because your investors were threatening to break your legs. You used my grandfather's money to save your own pathetic life. You are a fraud. You have always been a fraud. You live off my brand deals because you cannot even afford to lease the cars you post on your Instagram." The guests were actively narrating the collapse into their live streams. Millions of viewers across the globe were watching the ultimate luxury power couple violently tear each other apart in high definition. Jamal roared back, calling Sienna a plastic, talentless gold digger who orchestrated the entire heist because her engagement metrics were dropping. They were screaming full, detailed confessions to international wire fraud directly into the microphones of 50 different smartphones. Inspector Hayes did not even need to interrogate them. They were doing his job for him live on the internet. Seeing the younger couple self-destruct, Brenda realized the entire plot was being laid bare for the federal government. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, overriding whatever shred of marital loyalty she had left. Brenda whipped her head around and locked her panicked gaze onto my father. "Tell them, Richard," Brenda shrieked, tears of mascara streaming down her cheeks, ruining her expensive aesthetic. "Tell the FBI that you forced me to do this. You are the one who hired the corrupt notary. You made me sign the power of attorney while my father was on a ventilator. You told me we would lose the country club membership if we did not pay off our debts. I am just a mother trying to survive. My husband is the mastermind." Richard, who had spent my entire life standing quietly in the background, letting my mother dictate every family narrative, finally snapped. The sheer weight of his impending bankruptcy, the public humiliation, and the prospect of dying in a federal penitentiary broke him completely. "Do not you dare play the victim, Brenda." Richard bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You spent $30,000 a month on credit cards trying to impress women who secretly hate you. You are the one who stood over your own father's hospital bed and said he was practically dead anyway. You said his money was rotting in a bank while you were forced to wear last season U.S. clothes. You drove us into massive debt and you orchestrated this entire theft to buy your way back into high society. You are a monster." The perfect family was devouring itself. The polished upper-middle-class facade that Brenda had aggressively maintained for 32 years was violently ripped away, exposing the greedy, rotting core underneath. They were screaming obscenities at each other, airing decades of toxic resentment, financial failure, and vicious selfishness. They did not care about family loyalty. They did not care about love. When faced with the brutal consequences of their own actions, their only instinct was to cannibalize one another to save themselves. The irony was almost too sweet to bear. For my entire life, my parents had demanded absolute loyalty. They demanded that I keep their secrets, hide their flaws, and present a united front to the outside world. They demanded I sacrifice my own happiness to maintain the illusion that we were a flawless, successful American family. But the moment their freedom was threatened, that so-called unbreakable family bond disintegrated into absolute nothingness. I stood silently by the marble island, watching the carnage unfold. I did not need to say a single word. I did not need to raise my voice or hurl insults. The sheer gravity of the trap my grandfather and I had set was doing all the heavy lifting. I watched Brenda spit curses at the man she had been married to for decades. I watched Sienna cry genuine ugly tears as the husband she had constantly flaunted on social media actively begged federal agents to send her to prison instead of him. This was the true payoff. Seeing them in handcuffs was satisfying, but watching them voluntarily destroy their own reputations, their marriages, and their carefully curated public images was absolute poetic justice. They had spent my entire life telling me I was the broken one. They had labeled me the disappointment. Yet here they were proving to the entire world that they were nothing more than a pack of ravenous scavengers who would gladly turn on their own blood the second the money ran out. Agent Reynolds stepped into the center of the screaming match. He raised his hands, signaling his tactical team to move in and shut it down. "That is enough." Reynolds barked, his voice slicing through the chaotic screaming match like a steel blade. "You all have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you start exercising it before you confess to any more federal felonies on camera." The tactical agents forcefully spun Jamal, Sienna, Brenda, and Richard around, marching them aggressively toward the massive oak front doors. The party guests parted like the Red Sea, clearing a wide path for the criminals to be escorted out of the mansion they had stolen. As they approached the grand threshold of the mansion, Sienna suddenly dug her heels into the imported marble floor. She threw her entire body weight backward, thrashing violently against the firm grip of the female federal agent holding her arms. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. The shoulder strap of her custom silk gown had snapped during the struggle, leaving her looking utterly feral and unhinged. But the moment Sienna managed to lock eyes with me across the grand foyer, her entire demeanor shifted. The aggressive cornered animal vanished instantly, replaced by the role she had successfully played her entire life: the helpless, innocent victim. "Cassidy!" "Please," Sienna screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. "Tell them to stop! You can stop this! Tell them it is just a family misunderstanding. We can fix this. I will give you the money back. Just tell them it is a mistake." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her request hung heavily in the air. A family misunderstanding. She had actively conspired to frame me for a federal crime that carried a 20-year prison sentence. She had gone on the internet and tried to destroy my professional reputation, labeling me a mentally unstable monster to millions of strangers. She had laughed directly in my face while drinking champagne funded by the theft of our dead grandfather, U.S. life savings. And now, facing the catastrophic, life-ruining consequences of her own actions, she expected me to fall right back into my designated role. She expected the quiet, reliable older sister to shield her from reality. She expected me to absorb her punishment just like I had absorbed her insults for the last 32 years. "We are blood! Cassidy!" Brenda wailed from a few feet away, struggling weakly against her own arresting officer. "You cannot let them take us away in handcuffs. We are your parents. We gave you life. You will be alone forever if you do this. No family will ever want you." I looked at the four of them. Jamal was practically hyperventilating his flashy bravado, entirely replaced by the terrifying realization that his crypto assets were frozen and his freedom was gone. Richard was staring blankly at the floor, his spirit completely broken by the public humiliation and the prospect of dying in a federal holding cell. Brenda was sobbing, relying on manipulative guilt trips that no longer held any power over me. And Sienna was begging, utilizing the fake tears that had always shielded her from accountability. They were a miserable, pathetic portrait of greed and hubris. I felt absolutely no pity. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for 3 decades was completely dead. My grandfather had given me the tools to burn this bridge, and I was going to make sure nothing but ashes remained. I stepped forward, my black heels clicking sharply against the stone. I closed the distance until I was standing just a few feet away from my sister. The entire foyer fell completely silent. The pulsing red and blue lights from the dozens of federal cruisers parked in the driveway washed over my face, casting sharp, imposing shadows across the marble walls. "A family misunderstanding," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly flat, loud enough for every single guest and federal agent in the room to hear. You forged a medical power of attorney over a dying man. You set up an offshore shell company using my social security number. You tried to hand me over to the Internal Revenue Service so you could buy a luxury house for your Instagram feed. That is not a misunderstanding, Sienna. That is a federal conspiracy. I did not know what Jamal was doing. Sienna sobbed hysterically, completely throwing her husband under the bus for a second time. I am innocent. Cassidy, please, I am your little sister. I love you. Do not let them put me in a cage. I leaned in slightly, locking my eyes with hers. The cold, analytical detachment of my profession shielded me from her fake tears. You told me I was just a boring office worker, I said, my voice ringing with absolute icy finality. You said I pushed useless papers around all day. Well, a boring office worker like me does not know how to forge legal documents or launder millions across international borders. I paused, letting the brutal reality settle over her trembling frame, but the FBI certainly does. Enjoy your new house, Sienna. Sienna let out a guttural, agonizing scream of absolute despair as the agents finally dragged her through the doorway and out into the cold night air. Jamal began cursing loudly, hurling empty, pathetic threats at me that faded beneath the blaring sirens of the federal convoy. Brenda and Richard were weeping openly, their upper-middle-class dignity completely shattered as they were shoved into the back of armored transport vehicles. I did not follow them outside to watch them get loaded into the police cruisers. I simply turned my back. The rhythmic metallic clinking of their handcuffs echoed behind me, a sharp, satisfying sound that signaled the permanent end of their reign of terror. I walked straight through the crowd of stunned influencers, social climbers, and hypocritical relatives. They parted from me immediately, their eyes wide with fear and overwhelming respect. Nobody dared to speak a single word. Nobody dared to raise a smartphone to record me. They recognized exactly who held the power in this room. Agent Reynolds stood near the indoor waterfall, overseeing the cataloging of the seized assets. He caught my eye as I walked past and gave me a final approving nod. The federal government had taken out the trash and my job here was officially done. I walked out the front doors, leaving the sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion behind me. Yellow crime scene tape was already being strung across the massive wrought iron gates. The ultimate symbol of their fake generational wealth was now just another seized asset in a federal evidence locker. I handed my valet ticket to a terrified-looking parking attendant. He scrambled to retrieve my modest, reliable sedan. I slipped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away from the flashing police lights. I drove down the winding roads of Calabasas, leaving the burning wreckage of my toxic family completely in the rearview mirror. I had walked into that estate as the discarded, underestimated daughter. I was driving away as the sole heir to a massive commercial empire, entirely free, fiercely independent, and absolutely untouchable. Exactly 7 days after the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the Calabasas driveway, my secured work phone rang. I was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in my grandfather U.S. restored study in Seattle. Over the past week, Oliver and I had worked tirelessly to transition the management of the $15 million commercial real estate portfolio directly into my hands. The heavy antique furniture that the moving crew had hauled away was legally retrieved and placed exactly where it belonged. The house felt warm again, smelling of rich wood polish and the expensive dark roast coffee my grandfather always favored. My life had settled into a rhythm of absolute peace and commanding authority. The caller ID on my phone displayed a generic automated toll-free number. I knew exactly what it was. As a federal fraud investigator, I was intimately familiar with the automated routing systems of the United States Federal Bureau of Prisons. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the profound shift in power dynamics before tapping the screen to accept the call. An automated robotic voice immediately warned me that this call was originating from a federal detention center and would be recorded and monitored. Then the line clicked over. "Cassidy, please do not hang up my mother," a voice cracked through the receiver. The polished, arrogant tone Brenda had weaponized my entire life was completely gone. She sounded hollow, frantic, and stripped of all her upper-middle-class pretension. In the background, I could hear the harsh metallic echoing of steel doors slamming shut and the chaotic murmur of a federal holding block. It was a far cry from the serene crashing of ocean waves she had enjoyed on the chartered catamaran just a few weeks prior. I did not say a word. I simply leaned back in my grandfather U.S. leather executive chair, listening to the desperate, ragged breathing of the woman who had tried to frame me for international wire fraud. "We know about the real Will," Richard shouted, his voice suddenly cutting in over the shared receiver. My father sounded like a caged animal. "The federal prosecutors gave our court-appointed public defender the discovery files yesterday. We know your grandfather left you the $15 million commercial real estate trust. We know you have the money, Cassidy." I slowly took a sip of my black coffee. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. Even sitting in matching orange jumpsuits inside a concrete cell, their very first instinct was to count my money. "And what exactly do you want me to do with that information?" I asked, my voice as calm and unbothered as a still lake. "You need to post our bail," Brenda sobbed, the desperation making her voice pitch painfully high. "The judge denied our initial bond request because they considered Jamal a massive flight risk, but a high-powered defense attorney could get that reversed. You have millions in liquid capital now, Cassidy. You can afford the best legal team in the country. You have to hire someone to get us out of here. The food is inedible. We are sleeping on thin mattresses over solid steel bunks. I cannot survive in this place. I am losing my mind." I slowly traced the rim of my coffee mug. "You should have thought about the thread count of prison mattresses before you bribed a notary while your own father was dying on a ventilator," I replied coldly. "We are your parents," Richard bellowed, slamming what sounded like a fist against a glass partition. "You cannot just leave us in here to rot. We made a terrible lapse in judgment, but we are still your blood. You are our daughter. Family helps family when they make mistakes." "A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill," I corrected him, my tone sharpening into a lethal edge. "Orchestrating a multi-million-dollar international money laundering scheme to buy an influencer mansion is not a mistake. It is a highly coordinated federal felony, and framing your own daughter to take the fall for it is an act of pure, unadulterated evil. Do not invoke the word family to me. You voided that contract the second you typed my social security number into that Cayman Islands registry." "Cassidy, please," Brenda wailed, abandoning all dignity and outright begging. "I brought you into this world. I raised you. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. $15 million. What is $1 million to you now to save your own mother and father from dying behind bars? We will do whatever you want. We will sign any contract. Just get us out of this cage. Sienna is in a different cell block, and she has not stopped screaming for 2 days. Jamal is turning against us to cut a plea deal. We are begging you. Blood is thicker than water. You have to show us some mercy." I stood up from the mahogany desk and walked over to the large bay window. The Seattle rain had cleared, leaving a brilliant, cloudless blue sky over the city. I looked out at the sprawling, lush gardens my grandfather had meticulously cultivated over his lifetime. He had built an empire of integrity, hard work, and sharp intellect. He had seen right through their parasitic greed and handed me the sword to cut them out of our legacy forever. I held the phone close to my mouth, ensuring my final words would be recorded perfectly by the federal monitoring system for the prosecutors to hear. My mercy was buried with Grandpa. I said every single syllable, dropping like heavy stones into the receiver. "You gambled your entire lives on the belief that I was weak. You lost. Federal prison has no room for pity, and neither do I. Enjoy the concrete." "No, Cassidy, wait, please," Brenda shrieked. I tapped the red button on my screen, instantly severing the connection. I did not just hang up. I opened my security settings and permanently blocked the detention center U.S. incoming routing numbers. I blocked the public defender U.S. office. I blocked every single avenue they could ever use to reach me again. The line was dead, and with it the final pathetic remnants of my toxic family were completely wiped from my existence. I set the phone face down on the desk, feeling a profound, untouchable silence settle over the room. I was entirely free. The weeks that followed played out exactly as I had calculated, though watching the absolute destruction of their lives through the lens of federal court dockets provided a clinical, deeply satisfying closure. My family had built a house of cards on a foundation of deceit, and the federal government was the hurricane that finally blew it all away. Jamal, true to his cowardly and self-serving nature, immediately tried to cut his losses. The moment he realized the severity of the federal charges and the sheer magnitude of the digital evidence stacked against him, he threw his flashy marriage right into the wood chipper. From his federal holding cell, he directed his court-appointed attorney to file emergency divorce papers against Sienna. He genuinely believed that legally separating from my sister would somehow detach him from the conspiracy. He thought he could use the divorce proceedings to shield his hidden crypto wallets, claiming those digital assets were acquired prior to the marriage and totally unrelated to the wire fraud. It was a laughable, desperate maneuver from a man who fundamentally misunderstood how federal financial law actually operates. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division does not care about marital status when tracing internationally laundered funds. They treat blockchain obfuscation as a minor inconvenience, not a roadblock. Federal cyber agents tracked his decentralized tokens right to the source. Every single digital wallet Jamal bragged about on his podcasts, the ones he thought were completely anonymous and untouchable, was forcibly decrypted by government specialists. The authorities seized the $3 million of bait money, along with every other illicit penny he had generated through his fraudulent crypto pump and dump schemes over the years. The Calabasas mansion was officially repossessed by the Treasury Department before the escrow ink was even dry. His luxury cars were towed from the driveway and impounded. Jamal went from claiming he was playing three-dimensional financial chess to wearing a standard-issue khaki inmate uniform. He was completely stripped of his diamonds, his offshore accounts, and his arrogant swagger, eventually accepting a plea deal that guaranteed he would spend the next 15 years staring at a concrete wall. Sienna suffered a destruction uniquely tailored to her deepest insecurities. Her entire existence, her whole sense of self-worth was inextricably tied to her digital validation. The moment the live-streamed FBI raid went viral, the internet turned on her with a viciousness reserved only for exposed frauds. Her 2 million followers did not just vanish, they actively mobilized against her. The comment sections of her remaining videos became a digital graveyard of insults, mockery, and exposure. Brands dropped her within hours. Her management agency released a harsh public statement severing all ties and condemning her actions. The social media platforms themselves eventually suspended her accounts permanently for violating terms of service regarding criminal activity. She was completely erased from the internet. When she finally appeared in federal court for her sentencing hearing, the glamorous soft girl influencer was nowhere to be found. She stood before the federal judge looking pale, gaunt, and utterly ordinary in her prison jumpsuit. Without the heavy filters, the professional ring lights, or the stolen money to hide behind, she was just a 29-year-old felon crying in front of a magistrate. She pleaded for leniency, claiming she was manipulated by Jamal and blinded by grief. The judge showed zero mercy, citing her active, enthusiastic participation in attempting to frame her own sister to fund a luxury lifestyle. She was handed a mandatory 7-year sentence. Her empire of likes and sponsorships was traded for a highly regulated life inside a federal women U.S. correctional facility. But the most satisfying collapse belonged to Brenda and Richard. They had spent their entire adult lives desperately clinging to the illusion of upper-middle-class superiority. They sacrificed their own daughter, their morals, and their own father's dignity just to maintain their country club status. The federal government dismantled that status piece by agonizing peace. Because they were the primary signatories on the forged medical power of attorney, they took the heaviest legal hit for the initial fraud. The court ordered complete civil asset forfeiture to pay restitution and massive federal fines. Their suburban house, the one they had mortgaged to the hilt to maintain their affluent facade, was seized and auctioned off by the bank. Their remaining luxury vehicles were repossessed. Their bank accounts were frozen and drained to absolute zero. Even the expensive designer clothing, the jewelry, and the curated art pieces Brenda had hoarded over the decades were liquidated at government auctions to pay off their mounting legal debts. They were forced to declare total inescapable bankruptcy. At an age when they should have been retiring comfortably surrounded by the fruits of a well-lived life, they were left with absolutely nothing. They were stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and the social standing they valued above oxygen itself. The country club friends they had tried so hard to impress gave brutal, unsympathetic interviews to the local news stations, openly mocking their financial ruin and rapidly distancing themselves from the scandal. Brenda and Richard were both sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. They would spend the twilight of their lives sleeping on those thin, uncomfortable mattresses Brenda had cried about on the phone. They would eat bland institutional food, adhere to strict prison schedules, and live out their remaining days in the exact bleak, miserable isolation they had tried to force upon me. The perfect family they had aggressively projected to the world had eaten itself alive, leaving nothing behind but ruined lives, seized assets, and federal inmate numbers. Exactly 1 year later, the crisp rain-washed air of Seattle felt entirely different in my lungs. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of a city where I hid from my family and their endless judgment. It was the sharp, invigorating air of a territory I completely controlled. I stood on the corner of 4th Avenue, holding a steaming cup of dark roast coffee, looking up at the towering glass and steel facade of a newly renovated commercial building. This was not a flashy residential mansion in Calabasas bought with dirty money. This was a fortress of legitimate, unshakable power. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth, as I read the polished bronze letters mounted beside the main entrance. The Harrison Center for Elder Legal Defense. When Oliver and I fully assumed control of the $15 million commercial real estate portfolio, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I did not buy a luxury yacht. I did not purchase designer gowns or flaunt my net worth on social media to impress strangers. Instead, I merged my highly specialized expertise as a corporate fraud investigator with the massive financial leverage my grandfather had gifted me. I established a heavily funded, aggressively staffed legal clinic dedicated entirely to protecting elderly individuals from financial exploitation. My team of ruthless forensic accountants and high-powered attorneys hunted down predatory relatives, corrupt caretakers, and fraudulent financial advisors. We built a specialized legal machine designed to destroy people exactly like Brenda, Richard, and Jamal before they could ever drain another vulnerable person and ruin their life savings. We froze illicit bank accounts, reversed forged powers of attorney, and handed federal prosecutors perfectly packaged criminal dossiers. I had taken the exact method I used to dismantle my own toxic family and scaled it into a full-blown nationwide operation. People in my industry often ask if I feel any lingering guilt about putting my own parents and sister in federal prison. They assume that blood ties inevitably leave some kind of invisible scar, a phantom ache that flares up in the quiet moments of the night when the distraction of work fades away. But as I stood there watching the bustling morning commute, I realized with absolute clarity that I felt nothing but profound, untouchable peace. I was not haunted by the past. I was not burdened by the toxic obligations that society tries to force upon abuse survivors. My family had handed me a loaded gun, pointed it at my head, and expected me to pull the trigger for their financial benefit. Taking that weapon from their hands and turning it back on them was not a tragedy. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. My grandfather had seen my potential long before I fully recognized it myself. He knew I had the steel spine required to endure the ultimate betrayal and emerge victorious. He did not just leave me money. He gave me the absolute moral permission to cut the rotting branches off my family tree and watch them burn to the ground. The glass doors of the center slid open. Oliver walked out carrying a pristine leather briefcase. At 61 years old, he looked sharper and more energized than ever, having eagerly taken on the role of chief legal counsel for the foundation. He stopped beside me on the pavement, following my gaze up to the bronze lettering shining brilliantly in the morning sun. He adjusted his glasses and offered a quiet, deeply satisfied smile. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of you, Cassidy," Oliver said, his voice carrying the steady weight of absolute certainty. He built a real estate empire to protect himself from a harsh world. But you took his empire and turned it into an impenetrable shield for thousands of others. You became the precise executioner he knew you could be, and then you built something genuinely beautiful from the wreckage of that betrayal. I smiled back at him, feeling the solid, undisputed reality of my life anchor me to the pavement. I did not need to run anymore. I did not need to hide my success or minimize my intelligence to make insecure people feel comfortable. I was 33 years old, a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate mogul, and a highly feared federal fraud investigator operating entirely on my own uncompromising terms. I turned my attention away from the building and looked up at the Seattle sky. The thick, oppressive gray clouds that usually blanketed the city were breaking apart, allowing brilliant, intense shafts of golden sunlight to illuminate the towering skyscrapers all around us. The contrast was poetic. Thousands of miles away, my parents were waking up to the harsh metallic sound of sliding steel bars in a federal penitentiary. Sienna was mopping floors in a prison cafeteria, stripped of her makeup, her ring lights, and her fake digital validation. Jamal was staring at a concrete wall in a maximum security facility, permanently separated from the flashy crypto lifestyle he thought made him invincible. They had tried to bury me under the crushing weight of their own monumental greed. They tried to frame me, silence me, and destroy my future so they could live in a stolen fantasy. But they forgot one crucial detail. They forgot that I was a seed. They buried me in the dark, expecting me to rot. Instead, I took root. I broke through the soil, shattered their concrete foundation, and grew into something massive, deeply rooted, and absolutely impossible to tear down. I finished the last drop of my coffee, tossed the empty cup into a nearby recycling bin, and adjusted the lapels of my tailored suit. The air was crisp. The city was alive, and I had a full docket of new fraud cases waiting on my desk. I pulled open the heavy glass doors of my foundation, stepping confidently into the bright, buzzing lobby of my own empire. The past was completely erased, the villains were locked in cages, and my radiant, unshakable future was entirely mine to command. The most profound lesson embedded in Cassidy's harrowing journey of betrayal and triumph is that blood does not automatically grant someone a permanent pass to your life. Society conditions us to believe that family loyalty is an unbreakable contract, obligating us to endure toxic behavior, manipulation, and even outright abuse under the guise of forgiveness. However, Cassidy's story violently shatters that illusion. It teaches us that setting ironclad boundaries and being willing to entirely sever ties with those who seek to exploit or destroy us is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. For years, Cassidy internalized her family's dismissive narrative, shrinking herself to fit into the cramped, belittling box they built for her. When their narcissism escalated from emotional neglect to a literal federal crime designed to steal her freedom, she was faced with a defining choice: continue playing the victim or become the architect of her own justice. By weaponizing her intellect and refusing to yield to manipulative guilt trips, she reclaimed her power. The lesson here is that our self-worth is never defined by those incapable of seeing it. When the people who are supposed to protect you become your greatest threat, walking away is not a failure, it is a rebirth. You do not owe your future to people who actively try to sabotage it. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine support, and unwavering trust, whether those people share your DNA or not. Cassidy transformed her darkest betrayal into a fortress of strength, proving that when you stop seeking validation from toxic people, you free yourself to build an empire of your own. Take a hard look at the relationships draining your spirit out of mere obligation and find the courage to finally choose yourself today.